Chapter 8 deals with the logic of the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy consists of those permanent employees of the U.S. government who remain in office due to merit and their expertise. Oftentimes, they're seen as non political figures. We've seen recently a little bit of controversy over the president trying to change the way the bureaucracy has worked recently. And uh, bureaucracies have as their tendency to be very difficult to change the directions in which they're headed. One of the best discussions of the bureaucracy is by German social scientist and politician Max Weber. Max Weber came up with 6 characteristics of a bureaucracy, having studied the Prussian civil service in the period before the First World War. His 6 characteristics of a bureaucracy can be variously described. After all, it was originally in German. But these 6 terms that we have here give us a really solid idea of what we're talking about. First of all, a bureaucracy tends to have a hierarchical structure or a top-down structure, where the person at the top is responsible to the political or governmental leaders and has people who work for him. And from there, they have subordinates and other subordinates below them. Essentially, what we're looking to is that everybody is responsible for the chain of command. It's probably likely that the Prussian civil service had developed this from the military, but then they decided to become much more formalized. So if you are working as the special agent in charge of the Kansas City field office of the FBI, you're responsible to somebody back in Washington, but you also have people, special agents of the FBI, who work for you. And this is how that system works. Now, there is also a division of labor, a term sometimes called specialization. The division of labor says that everybody has specific tasks. You don't go into the office as a special agent in the Kansas City field office of the FBI and say, well, today maybe I will be handling a fraud case, but maybe I'll also be the person responsible for cleaning the restrooms. You have a specific task, and it's assigned to you according to your job requirements. Third, there's a career system or a merit or qualifications-based system. This means that promotion tends to come from sometimes passing a test, but more often getting good evaluations of your work. There's a tendency to expect to work for the government for an extended period of time. Fourth, we're looking at specified goals that are set outside the organization. So if you are required to do certain things as a responsibility of your job, it tends, well, in the American system, it works really well. We know, for instance, that the FBI is responsible for investigating things. They're the Federal Bureau of Investigations. The Civil Rights Office of the Department of Justice is responsible for civil rights. Now, what that means at any given time is set by the political leadership of the government. And the Civil Rights Office is required to follow proper procedures, but to achieve those goals. Next, we have a system of rules. In the United States government, the system of rules is formally set. There are specific requirements for every job as to what you're supposed to do in order to keep your job, but also what you're supposed to do in any one of numerous different situations. And these can be changed from above, But so long as you are following procedures, it becomes very difficult for the leadership to get rid of you for something you've already done. Now, they can always change what those rules are, and the rulemaking system within the US government is very complex and could be a course unto itself. And then 6, we have impersonality, or the idea of everybody being treated equal given their condition. And we'll talk a little bit more about that um, as we go. But the idea of impersonality is that everyone gets treated the same. The structure of the executive branch is not determined by the Constitution. Instead, the bureaucracy is located within the executive branch, and almost all of the power that it has comes through delegation. That is to say that Congress has certain powers. You'll notice it says to coin money, to collect taxes, to have an army, to have a navy. And in so doing, the legislative branch establishes these under law and then transfers their management to the executive branch. The earliest of these, the Department of Treasury, of State, and of War, were in George Washington's cabinet. There was an Attorney General, but no Department of Justice until around the time of the Civil War. So the idea of the bureaucracy is that they're carrying out tasks that are assigned to them, but there's really no constitutional provision for them specifically. When they were setting up the bureaucracy, they had several issues. First of all, they needed to decide how they would subdivide these departments. There's really two choices you have. One, you could create subdivisions based on specialization, the so-called bureau system that we have today, where we divide the Department of Justice into different offices that are responsible for different things. You could also theoretically have just a bunch of generalists. Get us this guy, and he's really good at a million things, and we'll put him in charge of whatever we need most done. And the US government has generally avoided that plan. Now, you might also ask, who exactly do the departments work for? As I told you, that most of the power of these bureaucracies come from delegation. First, the power belongs to Congress. They create a law, and then they say this agency will carry it out. There was an Environmental Protection Act that created the Environmental Protection Agency. And then that agency was given to the president to run, but it wouldn't theoretically have to have been, except that practice has sort of established that now the president does have control over all of the executive branch. And then another question you might ask is, well, who should serve in government? Originally, presidents like George Washington tried to divide the power up amongst representatives of each of the various states and said, well, we'll have somebody in charge of the port of Boston who's from Massachusetts, for instance, and we'll ask the most important people in Massachusetts who that person should be. We'll look a little bit later at Andrew Jackson's rotation in office system, and then finally we'll look at what is done today with civil service. The effort to find a way to staff the US government led directly to the creation of the Democratic Party. Andrew Jackson, who was president of the United States in the late 1820s and 1830s, came up with what he called rotation in office, and his political opponents called the spoils system. He said that the government, the people who led the government, should be responsible for finding people who will carry out the tasks that the president assigns to them. And that the best way to do this would be to find and staff the government with political supporters of the president. He viewed this as a type of democratization, which is a commentary on what we must have had beforehand, which was that the leading figures within society would choose their favorites and put them in charge of important jobs. This, though, is not really a bureaucracy as we envision it today. It has many, many different government jobs, but people don't have any sense of permanency, because if your side loses, then the new party who has just won will replace everyone. Inevitably, this system led to a great deal of corruption. After all, you didn't keep your job by doing a good job. You kept your job by making sure that your political patrons won. If you wanted to remain the postmaster of your town, you had to make sure that your party's leader became president of the United States. Well, if you wanted any kind of uh, consistency and expertise, and people who were worried about actually running post offices or you know government offices of any kind, you needed to make sure that some of these people were protected. And this led to the Pendleton Civil Service Act in 1883. And initially, it only covered a few government employees. But what happened is, at the end of every time that a government was in charge, they would add somebody. They'd say, well, we're lame ducks, but we want to make sure that our supporters, that their jobs are safe. So they would add in law just a few more people to the civil service rolls. And by the time Franklin Roosevelt became president in 1933, about 80% of federal workers were included in the merit system. And that's a number that's pretty consistent with today. There are also problems, though, with the career system. After all, it creates a culture within each agency. The kind of person who chooses to be in the FBI is a different person than the kind of person who chooses to be in the EPA. And maybe even more than that, the people within every agency are looking now to protect their agency rather than to look at the best interest of the government as a whole. And it changes the incentives. Before, people who worked for the government saw it as their job to promote the political goals of the administration. And now they see it as their goal to just protect their jobs and to protect the goals that are those of their organization. And when a president doesn't actually have to fill out the forms to hire everybody, it allows for a dramatic increase of the size of government. We've talked elsewhere about how government grows in times of war, economic crisis, and as we start to discover new things that we view as being public issues. Almost anything can be seen as a public issue: pollution, homelessness, healthcare. At one time or another, these were not seen as public issues. They were seen as something that individuals were responsible for. And as time has gone on, we've decided that they're things that people as a group should collectively take action about. The next two slides show us the development of the president's cabinet across time. In the beginning, there was just the state, the Treasury, and War Departments, which were eventually combined to form the Defense Department. And you see each of these other government departments were established to take care of specific problems. The Department of Interior started out as a land management branch of the government. The Department of Agriculture started out as a way to help farmers. The Republican Party had presented itself as a pro-farm party. The Justice Department, there had always been an Attorney General, but the Justice Department was there to help facilitate the interests of Reconstruction after the Civil War. The Department of Commerce, which was originally the Department of Commerce and Labor, was designed to promote business and also to look after the interests of people, the working people. They saw the conflict between this, and when the Democrats took over in 1913, they split the department in half so that the Labor Department would look after people who were the working people, and the Commerce Department would look after the people who were providing jobs. The Department of Health and Human Services, which was originally the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, and perhaps will be again, was based on President Eisenhower's concern about the health of American soldiers when he first took over the military during World War II. The Department of Housing and Urban Development was a result of the declining stock in good housing, particularly in large cities. The Department of Transportation was designed to help manage mass transportation in the United States. And but the list just continues to grow. Now there's many different government agencies, a total of 15. The Energy Department, because of the energy shortages. The Education Department was split from Department of Health, Education, and Welfare because President Carter was trying to promote the interests of teachers. Veterans Affairs, after there was a recognition that the Veterans Administration wasn't doing a very good job, and the Department of Homeland Security after the terrorist attacks in 2001. Independent regulatory commissions were designed to take away from the president the responsibility of actually having to decide regulatory issues on a case-by-case basis. The president maintains control over who manages these commissions, but at the same time, he's no longer responsible for deciding, for instance, a particular Equal Employment Opportunity Commission case. Similarly, independent government corporations were designed to deal with a particular type of policy problem. Certain government policies are designed to make sure that everyone can benefit or everyone has a chance to benefit while still wanting to maintain some economic context. So agencies like the post office or Amtrak, which is the passenger rail service, there's still this desire that they minimize the amount of loss. But we've decided that it's okay if they run a deficit so long as they serve a particular need. So in a hierarchical structure, sometimes you reach the very top of the bureaucracy. You're not somebody who will ever be a cabinet official. You're not somebody who will ever be a political appointee, but you still have an interest in managing your bureaucracy, your bureaucratic agency in such a way as to benefit it. And so what are your incentives? Well, you want to maximize budget. You want to maximize your autonomy from the political branches. You want to minimize your oversight so that your people can work without someone looking over their shoulder. You want to promote the cultural goals of the people who work there, and you want to influence Congress. If the president is doing something you don't want them to do, then you should try to get Congress to act on your behalf and as a protector. People study the bureaucracy, and one of the main things that interests them is how the political branches can control the bureaucracy. Remarkably, this is a difficult thing to do. Congress has a great deal of a role in oversight um, of the bureaucracy, particularly in terms of having hearings and making sure that the different bureaucratic agencies are doing what they say. We'll talk in a minute about just how much of a role they have here. Also, the Congress is responsible for authorizing or reauthorizing the activities of the bureaucracy. So, for instance, there's a farm bill that they pass every 5 years that's designed to tell the Department of Agriculture what it should do. There's a defense authorization bill, and sometimes it gets very detailed in how many troops we should have in different countries, and sometimes it's very broad. Oftentimes, the decision to move forward with different weapon systems is determined at this authorization level. And then finally, appropriation. Congress decides how much all of the different agencies and departments in government get. And if you are uh, somebody in the bureaucracy, it's definitely uh, to your advantage to have a good rapport with Congress when it comes to deciding how much money is to be distributed. Congress has established several processes by which they can control the bureaucracy that have become formalized over the years. First of all, we look at hearings and investigations where the agencies testify, and these can be both regularly scheduled and could also occur on an emergency basis. Mandatory reports on programs provided to Congress. So these agencies are supposed to update Congress regularly on what's going on and how it's working. Legislative vetoes of agency policy proposals. So if an agency comes up with a set of rules, Congress can specifically pass a bill designed to reject those. And then if it's signed by the president, uh, then the agencies have to go back to step one. Committee and conference reports that provide instructions to the agencies. So when a committee decide something, they'll send those instructions to the bureaucracy. But more importantly, when a law is passed, it often gives detailed instructions. Inspectors general audit the books. Inspectors general are internal auditors, and Congress tries to take a direct role, and inspectors general tend to then come and testify to Congress. The Government Accountability Office, or the GAO, and the GAO's had several different names over the years, but the initials are always GAO, is an external auditor that reports the performance of agencies to Congress. The GAO is an awful lot like Congress's version of the Office of Management and Budget. And they can also put a time limit on the delegations of authority, as I was talking before about the Farm Bill and the Education Bill and the Defense Authorization Bill. The president has numerous tools at his disposal for managing the bureaucracy. Perhaps the most important thing that we should keep in mind is he sits at the top of the bureaucracy. They're executive agencies, and he is the chief executive. A lot of attention's been paid right now to the idea that the president is, in fact, the only person vested with executive authority in the U.S. government. The president has appointment power, along with Senate approval, to place people in the important jobs at the very top of the bureaucracy. So the bureaucrats themselves might not be overly happy with who gets appointed, but it's really up to the president to decide who is. Additionally, thanks to the Office of Management and Budget and the process of the president forming his own budget that then has to be approved by Congress, has a great deal of control over all of the spending priorities and thus who gets what. And then finally, the president can issue what are called executive orders. And executive orders, as we've talked about, are very important for directing the government on how to carry out laws. Finally, the courts also have a role in controlling the bureaucracy. Quite often, when there's debate between the president and Congress, or even between the bureaucracy and the president, it comes down to whether the courts are willing to step in and enforce the law. Courts enforce what's called the Administrative Procedures Act. So government agencies have a great deal of leeway in determining regulations related to enforcing laws. However, this isn't unlimited. The Administrative Procedures Act determines the ways in which government regulations need to be enacted. And if someone can make a credible claim that the Administrative Procedures Act hasn't been followed, government regulations can be overturned. Actions can also be appealed as to matters of law. The question would be whether the bureaucracy is actually following the law in determining the regulations that they're enacting. Now, there is a great deal of deference on the part of courts in the interpretation of whether regulations are adhering to the law. And the bureaucracy needs to have very little rational basis for what they've done, or to have clearly violated the wording of the law in order for their decisions to not be for their decisions to be overturned. But it does happen. And then finally, actions of the bureaucracy can be appealed as to matters of civil rights and civil liberties. There's nothing in the Administrative Procedures Act or any law passed by the government that enables the bureaucracy to violate the Constitution when it comes to civil rights and civil liberties. One area of particular importance to people who study uh, the bureaucracy are iron triangles, or the idea of agency capture when there are very few people who are paying in direct interest on government actions on a day-to-day basis. Essentially, an iron triangle is those times when executive agencies, congressional subcommittees, and the industry or its interest groups work together to achieve policy goals that are not necessarily those of the American people. Essentially, we think of a executive agency as being the overseer, as being the regulator of an industry. However, we look at the congressional subcommittee as being the overseer or the um, regulator of the executive agency. And as long as that's a top-down structure, there's not a problem. However, one of the things that we see are that businesses or the interest groups that represent industries might be able to go to Congress and manipulate the members of Congress, either by donating a great deal of money or by working with them to create an environment where the executive agency needs to go along with the interest of the business rather than to regulate the business. And even more than that, what we see is that many people who work for the government, either in Congress or in those executive agencies that are designed to be regulating an industry, then go and work in private industry. You see, for instance, people who are in the military, colonels and generals, they retire, and then what do? They go and they work for defense contractors. Now, if you were the next general, would you look to see and say, look, the guy who used to have my job is now making an awful lot of money working working in the private sector, maybe I should be nice to those people so that when I get my 25 years in or my 30 years in, I can still spend the last 15 years of my work life cashing out. And if that happens, we get what's called agency capture. The people in the executive agency say, I need to do what the industry wants so that Congress stays off my back, but also so that I can have a friendly relationship with them in case I'm ever looking for a job. And the only way to really interrupt that is to get other people paying attention, because those three groups have every incentive to lock everyone else out of the policy making community.
Whoa, this is an example of an issue network. I don't quite remember what the interest group was. I believe I believe that this has something to do with healthcare policy. When we talk about issue networks, we tend to speak of centrality or how close a interest group is to the actual decision makers, and whether the decision makers that they're close to are the primary or whether they're secondary decision makers. They talk in terms of nodes, which is to say, who has connections to whoever else. Well, anyways, it's a much more complicated chart than the iron triangle was, and the more people who get involved in policy making, the more complex it is. And you still could probably find somewhere in there a triangle. And if you looked at that triangle, you would probably see that one center of power is Congress, another center of power are the bureaucracies, and another center of power are the interest groups. But many, many, many others are able to form and force access into policy making. So, in a world where so many people seem to have access, we should probably go back to this thought of impersonality that Max Weber suggested to us. Perhaps red tape can be our friend. Perhaps red tape, or the need to fill out forms and to justify all the actions that they take part in, helps us with bureaucrats. Because what we want to do is we want to take away as much discretion as possible. Unless you are a person who has greater than average access to the people who have power or to the people who have control over your life, you want everyone in a similar situation to you to be treated in the same way.
Perhaps someday you will be audited by the IRS. And if you're audited by the IRS, I think you'll be very happy if you happen to remind the IRS agent of her mother rather than reminding her of her mother in law. Well, she might like her mother in law, but the illustration is if she's feeling very, very much like you're somebody who is one of the good guys and has tripped up, you're in much better shape than if she thinks you're one of the bad guys and that something should be done about you. And this is just a little illustration that I have of this. Imagine when you much rather have the relationship with the IRS agent on the right than on the left, or maybe you'd rather that you would just be treated like everyone else.